All right, welcome everybody. This is our week summary of the Derek Chauvin trial with local attorneys. Um, Thank you for joining us. For those who are watching, feel free to share with your network and others. And to get us started, we have Michelle Gross, who's going to be kind of co-hosting with me, as well as Jordan Kushner, who was here with us last week, a local attorney. I see Michelle's gonna right back in there. Um, so Michelle will join us here in a second. There goes Michelle. Michelle, maybe you can kind of start us off before Jordan goes off. As this week, it has been. It's been a very, very challenging week, just like every week. I think for me, the one thing that stood out the most was the medical professionals that testified, specifically the point where the specialist on breathing mentioned how George Floyd's body language resulted in him doing everything he can possibly do to try to breathe, moving his hips, moving his shoulders, his arms, and then on the opposite, Chauvin and the other officers did every single thing possible to not let him breathe, including Chauvin literally having his entire weight on George Floyd. So I'll let Michelle get us going, and then Jordan can kind of give us the legal analysis and kind of the review of the week.
Great. So thanks, Jaylani, and welcome to everybody who is watching us this week. It's been quite the week this week. I think probably pretty traumatic for a lot of people. People have said that it's been very hard to watch, but I think that I'm calling this week Medical Week because most all of the testifiers were medical people for the bulk of the week, and it seems that the point of the this whole week was to really nail down the cause of death, to eliminate those causes of death that the defense wants to try to bring in, like drug use and the heart condition and things of that nature. And I thought that the testifiers this week were very powerful, particularly Dr. Tobin and Dr. Thomas. Dr. Thomas basically said, yes, he had these problems, but they wouldn't have killed him that day. And I've been waiting for somebody to say exactly those words, and I was really happy to hear it. I also felt that, I've been in healthcare for 40 years, and I've taught a lot of healthcare, and I felt that the testifiers did a very good job of explaining complex medical, issues to the audience in a way that was very understandable for the people listening. So I thought, and for the jurors in particular, obviously they're the important ones that way. I thought that was very good. At the same time, I do, like I said, want to acknowledge that for the family of George Floyd, and for families of people who have been killed by police in other circumstances, this has got to be a very difficult week because, you're really talking clinically about the death of a loved one. And while that's absolutely necessary in the trial, it's still traumatizing. So, I kind of I've been thinking about that a lot the entire week. And, but I do think that this testimony this week was really powerful, and that it helped to debunk a lot of the defense, at least one of the pillars of the defense, which is the medical pillar. So with that, I'd like to ask Jordan to weigh in on what you thought about the testifiers this week and about the relative strength of the prosecution and the defense. Jordan?
Sure. Well, the prosecution is covering all the bases on the medical testimony. I think their biggest weakness was the county medical examiner, who was seemed kind of ambiguous about whether George Floyd's health conditions with heart problems and drug use, were a large contributing factor. And so I think the prosecution made up for it by calling a lot of experts, a lot of other medical experts. Of course, the pulmonologist was the most powerful expert, and he described vividly how the police killed George Floyd. But they called a police surgeon, and they called another medical examiner who used to work at Hennepin County, and then they called the final the actual medical examiner who did the medical examination, and so who still concluded that it was a homicide and the police killed George Floyd, but left more openings. So I think the prosecution really pulled out all the stops to close all these possible openings, and the medical testimony was really vivid and it sticks out in her head. But if we're going over the whole week, we probably, I almost forgot too that the beginning of the week was the police experts. And so you actually had the Minneapolis police chief coming out and condemning Derek Chauvin. And then they had a police expert from Los Angeles Police Department, and it escaped me. I think they had another police expert besides that, and they had a lot of people from the Minneapolis Police Department in different roles to try and say that Derek Chauvin's behavior was not excusable. And I think this is really politically significant, but also important not to lose sight of what's going on here. It's significant because usually the police officers stand behind each other, and there's the blue wall of silence even from the higher ups, and it's rare to actually see police higher ups from that department or from other departments coming and testifying against another police officer. So, what this tells us is politically there's been a decision by the law enforcement interests, both locally and nationally, that they need to throw Chauvin under the bus, because of obviously the national uproar that this has gotten. It's just too much to keep them on board here. They got to throw them away here, and so they've made up. There's been this political decision to have the police top brass from all over the place come and denounce him, which is going to be, and I think is going to be instrumental in probably ensuring a conviction here. But it's also key to not forget here that Derek Chauvin was very much a product of the Minneapolis Police Department. He engaged in this kind of behavior where he stepped on people's neck and other incidents. Had Michelle would know offhand, but I think he had like 20 complaints of misconduct.
Actually,
none of them were ever sustained. He never got in trouble before. He killed someone else. And he stayed on the force, never got disciplined. And plus, this incident, of course, we're going to hear about it in the trial this summer, but there were 3 other police with him that allowed this to happen. So he's a product of the police culture. And right now, I think a negative side effect here is that the police department is making themselves look good, with the chief saying that this doesn't represent the values of the Minneapolis Police Department. Well, he is the values of the Minneapolis Police Department. This is the rotten culture that they represent. And so from the community activist perspective, I think it's critical not to let them off the hook and to keep pushing that it's the police department that's the problem that allowed someone like Derek Chauvin to exist and eventually killed George Floyd.
Exactly.
So we need to demand change. And so far, and Michelle can weigh on this too, is since George Floyd was killed, I don't think there has been any significant change in the Minneapolis Police Department. So that's let's hope that there's justice in this case, but we need to not let them off the hook here. So I think the goal here is to get Derek Chauvin convicted so everyone can feel good and then forget what caused the problem in the first place.
I think you make a great point, Jordan. And there was a great article in Minnesota Spokesman Recorder this week that said that people of color and poor people in the community do not recognize the police department that Madera Arredondo is talking about, that such a department doesn't actually exist. So I think you're making a very great point. But a question I have for you is, had To the best of your knowledge, had the police chief ever testified in a criminal case against a police officer before? Is that because that seems to be a little bit out of the norm?
Yeah, I could go off the reports, which says that the mainstream news reports say it hasn't happened, and I think we can be confident it hasn't happened because there's so few criminal trials against police officers.
Yeah.
So and in those few, we can probably count them on a little bit more than one hand, and I'm pretty positive it hasn't happened.
Yes, like I was thinking about the Chris Ryder case, the man that kicked a handcuffed Somali man in the head and caused him a major brain injury. So he'll be, brain injured for the rest of his life. And in that case, I don't believe that the police chief did testify. So that's why it struck me as a little on the unusual side, even though, like I said, he certainly painted a vision of the police department that is not matching with the reality that many people have experienced. So that was.
I think the media played it up so much, but to me it was extremely disturbing. This was a propaganda ploy.
Yeah, exactly, and especially when you think about the fact that, like you mentioned, he had 26 complaints. He had also been in 4 prior deadly force incidents, and people don't realize that he had killed 4 people before he killed George Floyd, and he had also shot 2 other people who didn't happen to die. And so this guy was not only a problem child, but then they turned around and promoted him and made him a trainer. So that kind of tells you that they didn't think there was a problem with his conduct. And it's pretty interesting. So one of the questions I've been wanting to ask is, much has been said about what the Minneapolis Police Department trains people to do. And again, remember that Derek Chauvin was made a trainer. So one of the questions is, that seemed like that was going to be a pillar in the defense, is that Derek Chauvin's going to do this. I just did what I was trained to do, routine. What do you think about that particular argument?
Well, I was surprised that the defense attorney didn't bring that up. Maybe he's going to do it on the defense, but yes, I mean, he has. The prosecution is going to is going to be able to bring in some prior incidents, so they can point out, well, if you're saying that he wasn't trained to do this, well, he's never gotten in trouble for it before, and as you said, they made him a trainer. So I think I'm kind of surprised the defense attorney hadn't raised it, but at the end of the day, it's not a defense. Even though the police department is at fault for him and what he did, that doesn't let him off the hook.
Okay, that's good. Now, the other question that came up, I'm trying to think of what people have been saying in the community, is that the things that people learned about the conduct of the other officers in this trial makes people wonder why, these other officers are only being charged with sort of aiding and abetting, as opposed to themselves being charged with, a murder type charge, because they were leaning on his back also. Particularly, I think it was Kuhn was had his weight down at the lower, at the part of the lower part of Derek Chauvin's ribs, where it also made him difficult for him to breathe. So now people are starting to raise that question of, like, what about the charges of these other guys? And what do you think about that?
Well, I think it would be hard to show that they directly caused George Floyd's death. I mean, it was obviously the knee on the neck that cut off his oxygen. And so they might have, maybe them holding him down might have contributed to it. But the bottom line is, aiding it doesn't hurt it doesn't make it any less of the case to charge them with aiding and abetting, because the law says that if you aid and abet, you're just as responsible as the person who actually committed the crime. So they face the same potential sentences, regardless of whether they're charged as principals or with aiding and abetting. So frankly, it would be a big mistake, a huge mistake, not to charge them with aiding and abetting. It's why have to go through all the trouble and show that their actions actually killed George Floyd if all the prosecution has to do is show that they helped. Right.
Okay, so that makes more sense. And then one of the other kinds of things that people are talking about is, what areas do you think the prosecution still needs to cover? Because one of our listeners, or viewers, I should say, is saying that they'd heard that there was only going to be one more witness. And so, do you think there's other areas that the prosecution needs to touch on, or get into before they rest their side and let the defense go?
Not that I know of. I mean, I think that they have to show what actually happened, that it wasn't proper police procedure, and that what happened was the cause of George Floyd's death. So I think they presented evidence on all those angles. Frankly, I think they to some degree they've kind of overtried the case, because I think like the pulmonologist and one other, the medical examiner probably would have been enough. And I know that they had to call all those experts, because I think what it did is it kind of opened up, at the same time as they had some more angles, they also opened more holes. And the problem with these police experts is that they are police officers. So I think they justified a lot of things that shouldn't have been justified, where they kept talking about how someone can still be a danger when they're in handcuffs. Frankly, that's BS. I mean, maybe they can be a pain, but no, they're not a threat to police when they're in handcuffs. But you had these police experts who really, to them it was set in, it was their, it was scripture that people can still be threats when they're in handcuffs. And they had people acknowledge, these police experts agreeing that it can be a big problem and interfere with the police if there's a crowd. Well, again, that's BS. That's not an excuse at all for the police abusing someone because there's a crowd that's angry at seeing the police being abused. They're professionals and they have a responsibility to act properly. So I think that the prosecution is actually, at the same time as they're so thorough, I think in some ways they've opened more doors for the defense to find some holes and make some attacks. And so it seems to me like they've presented their case, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are not many witnesses, perhaps one witness left.
Well, and particularly that LA police expert, I didn't think his testimony was very strong at all. And that he kind of justified some stuff that I didn't think. I agree with you that I think he did do that. And so that was an interesting, situation. I kept thinking, now, why did they use him? And then the other person I wondered about was that the police medical coordinator, the woman, I kept thinking that, she really didn't help them with their case much at all. So I was kind of wondering what you thought about those two witnesses.
I didn't see the whole testimony, and I can't break them down specifically. But this is along the lines what I was talking about from what I heard from these witnesses was a lot of big concessions, things that should not have been conceded.
Yeah.
And so yeah, the police medical one she knew Derek Chauvin, right? She was the one who knew Derek Chauvin, who worked with him. And she seemed quite sympathetic to him, and I don't think there wasn't any need to call a witness with that kind of disposition for the defendant. They could have found plenty of people who wouldn't have had any kind of personal sympathy for him.
I have a question for you. I was wondering, how do you see the testimony in this case translating into changes in police procedures and policies?
Well, I think unfortunately, as I referenced kind of earlier in my spiel, that there's been a big emphasis by the Minneapolis Police Department to disown Derek Chauvin, with the chief and these other officers, to try and suggest that this isn't what the police department is about, which isn't true. It is what the police department is about. So unfortunately, I haven't seen the trial generating testimony that would show a need for change. And that's kind of in contrast to the Mohammed Noor trial, where the jury actually wrote the judge questions at the end, asking about what kind of changes could be made. In that case, the police looked really bad, and the jury actually submitted questions to the judge afterwards, requesting to find out what kind of changes would be made in police policy. It would be interesting if the jury takes that angle here, but I don't think they've been given the means to, because the police department top brass has been presented as the good guys, and Chauvin is the only bad guy. So I think this is going to take community initiative here to, to put the right narrative on this and show that this wasn't just one bad apple. This is someone who's implementing bad policies, who's part of a rotten culture.
Yeah.
There was a question in the audience that's asking a question about of the prior relationship between Chauvin and Mr. George Floyd at the nightclub, I believe that was. Do we see that being addressed in this trial?
I haven't seen it come up.
Yeah,
They almost seem to be avoiding it, and some of the people that, like, we do have a few former police officers that kind of work around CUAPB and things like that, and in those circumstances, those folks have all said, God, he had to have had a relationship with him to treat him that way, and there have been people that we talked with that worked with them both that said that Derek Chauvin did not like the fact that George Floyd was dating a white woman. And so that was a piece of the kind of the puzzle that, was interesting. And, one of our viewers has asked the question about, do we foresee violence if there's a hung jury? What I can say that I foresee is that if there's a hung jury or there's an acquittal, the violence I worry about is the violence from the police. Because what that will do is it will unleash the police, that if you can't even get a conviction in a case like this, then they will really truly know what they can get away with. And that is very concerning to me. I don't know if the rest of you agree with that assessment, but I really am deeply concerned about the license it would give to police to treat the community, to amplify their violence against the community.
No, absolutely. I agree. And I think that's the one thing that, we have to be mindful about, is that, we know that the more attention to cases like this, that they may fall into the anomaly, in the sense that, what happens in this case may not continue to happen. And that's really what we're trying to change. I mean, you guys talked earlier about the wall of silence, or the blue line of silence that is being broken here. But to be fair to many of the families who've lost their loved ones to police violence, to the countless families who did not get their story out publicly the way George Floyd's family and obviously this horrific case has been, or to the countless individuals who've been killed in prisons in the middle of the night through negligence, and others that have never been filmed. The reality is that blue line of silence now seems to be more convenient than anything else. Has there been a change? Will there be a change? Will officers continue to hold other officers accountable? I think they're all waiting for this trial and this case to end, to go back to business as usual, but they don't realize that the community has woken up, and I'm hopeful that the community has woken up and are demanding for change. But going back to, I guess, Jordan, I guess my general question is, the one thing that struck a chord with me was, you needed all of these medical professionals to testify to something that is just so obvious. And unfortunately, it's been pretty painful, but, I almost feel like the prosecution is trying to obviously undermine the defense response, which is much more of a medical response, excited delirium and some of these other things that they're probably more than likely to dig into. What do you think, just generally from your feeling? I mean, obviously we don't know all of the details, but do you think that there will be a big medical piece to the defense? That will they use that as a big part? And as you can see, Nelson today, the last couple of days, was trying to dig into some of that and just asking some random questions about, was he talking? Was George Floyd talking? And, is he talking here? And things like that. And so what do you think about the medical piece as being the largest and probably the only major thing that the defense have, and the prosecution trying to obviously have a stronger case because the medical examiner, as you mentioned earlier, Pitch really gave a lot of room for interpretation.
I agree. I think that's really the only thing the defense has going, and yeah, look, I think that the prosecution called this this police doctor from Louisville who believes that there's a such thing as excited delirium, which is, I think, is mostly discredited in the mainstream medical profession, but they actually called him because he said that there's no way that George Floyd had excited delirium. He went over the 10 different indicators of excited delirium, and not one of them applied in George Floyd's case. So they did effectively, I think they effectively shut down excited delirium. We'll see if somehow the defense can find some expert they can buy who will testify otherwise. But I think they're going to try and say that he had so many health problems between the heart and the drugs that there was a reasonable doubt as to whether it was really the cutting off of his air that caused his death. It's just basically going to say he would have died anyway. And certainly from our perspective, it looks really looks completely absurd. That's what they have to go on. That's what they're going to argue, and that's will it work? And I think told them the pulmonologist's testimony was really powerful, where he explained specifically what it was that Chauvin was doing and how it killed George Floyd. So I don't see the defense being able to overcome that, but that's what they have to go on. So they're going to try. There was also a question about earlier where I think I missed something, where people asked, well, what's left to prove? And the prosecution was given permission to show some incidents of past misconduct by Derek Chauvin, particularly where he had put his knee on someone else's neck beforehand. And so that still has to come, and that I think would probably take more than one other additional witness, unless the prosecution has changed their mind and decide not to get into that. But I think we are supposed to see some of the past instances of misconduct by Derek Chauvin.
There was two questions. There was two questions from the two experts that came up and that dealt with the fentanyl. And this is probably one of the biggest things that I saw coming out of the trial, when the experts were asked what were the symptoms of this stuff in George Floyd's body, specifically the fentanyl, and they indicated that if the fentanyl was a part of or caused part of his is the reason for him dying, he would have went into a coma, and that didn't happen. And then they asked the other expert witness the exact same question, and she said the exact same thing. And I think that's where the defense was trying to hang their hat on. And I'm just curious, Jordan, how big was that?
I think you said it. I would take it the same way, that it looks like they've got experts that foreclose that possibility that he OD'd on fentanyl. And so the question is the defense going to come up with, I don't think they can just argue it. I think they'll have to come up with their own expert who can come up with, support this kind of theory of George Floyd's death in order to have any credibility with the jury. And, we don't know who the defense is calling, and so we'll have to see.
We had something else interesting raised in the questions here from our viewers, and that is what effect would it have for, what effect would the state case have on the federal case? And as I understood the federal case, it was more related to tax fraud and some of the other kinds of charges that Chauvin is facing. But I could be wrong about that. Jordan, do you know if he's facing kind of
a
civil rights type case?
There's actually another state case brought against Chauvin and his wife for tax fraud. But the federal, the feds have been, there's no pending federal case that I know of, but they've been investigating a possible federal criminal charges against Derek Chauvin. And we actually learned a lot more about that today because we learned that that Baker, the medical examiner, had testified in front of a grand jury on 2 occasions, which tells and that's how the feds investigate these cases. They call these grand juries, which are these secret bodies that are only open to the prosecution. The prosecution presents evidence to them, and so they really serve 2 purposes. One is to investigate, because they can subpoena people, compel testimony in front of the grand jury to make a record, in support of a criminal prosecution, and then ultimately the grand jury has to approve criminal charges. And so the fact that they had the medical examiner there twice for a grand jury tells us that the feds are really serious about trying to build a federal criminal case against Chauvin. Now, they can do that regardless of the outcome of the state case. The way the law has been interpreted, there's arguments about double jeopardy, that you can't be, the Constitution says you can't be charged and prosecuted twice for the same crime. But the case law is pretty clear that as long as there's something, because they're different offenses, even though they're based on the same conduct, the feds can triumph for the criminal charge, basically of violating civil rights, regardless of the outcome of the state case. So if he got acquitted in the state case, almost certainly you could probably expect the feds to bring a criminal charge to try and hold him accountable. If he got off with a lesser charge on the state case, just manslaughter, and just got 4 years, the feds would probably, try and, my guess is they would charge him at that point to get him more time. And let's say he were to end up getting convicted of one of the murder counts, and the judge gave an upward sentencing departure. Instead of 12 and a half years, he gave him 25 years. Maybe the feds then would decide it wasn't worth it. So, but yeah, that's out there, and the feds can charge him with a federal offense.
So let me ask you a little bit more about that. So if he is, let's say, fully convicted of let's say the second-degree murder charge, which carries, I think, a 40-year sentence, a potential 40-year sentence.
Maximum, yeah.
Yeah, maximum 40-year sentence. And let's say that he got the maximum sentence. What would be the value or reason for doing a federal case?
I don't think there would be.
Okay. So, they're really sort of waiting in the wings in case things go south on this particular prosecution.
Yeah. I can't read their minds, but that's what I would suspect. I think it's unlikely that Derek Chauvin would get the maximum of 40 years because there's sentencing guidelines, that recommend what the sentence is supposed to be. And the sentencing guidelines are, basically for either the second or third degree murder, about 12 and a half years. There's a range. So it could be like for maybe 11 to 13 or so years, roughly in that range. And in order for the judge to go up, the jury has to decide that there's aggravating factors. And I know that the state had indicated that was their intent, was if they get Chauvin convicted of one of those murder counts, that they were then going to go to the jury and ask them to decide if there were aggravating factors, which would then allow the judge to give an upward departure in the sentencing guidelines. So if that were to, so we've got a number of steps. First, the state actually has to follow through and decide they want to do that. If they do that, then the jury has to agree. And then if they do, then the judge would decide how far to go up. I can't tell how far the judge will go up, but, I could see him doubling, to 25 years. I think going more than that seems unlikely based on how the law is and how the judge is supposed to do sentencing. So to me, I think the optimal scenario might be around 25 years, but again, I could be wrong on that. The judge could find some reason to impose more. But if you get up to that, he probably wouldn't get that much more if he got convicted with a federal offense. And it's potentially the federal offense could be life, but again, there's also federal guidelines, and so it probably wouldn't work out that way in reality. It would probably be in that approximate range.
Right. So let me ask you one other thing, because I've known you as for a pretty long time now, you work on both civil cases and criminal defense, so you've got a wide range in your practice. If you were defending Derek Chauvin, and I know you aren't and probably wouldn't, but if you were, well, first of all, what's your assessment of the quality of the prosecution and the defense? And then the second kind of question, I guess I'm wondering is, this is something that people have been saying all over Facebook and so forth, is why is it that this man let this go to trial? Like, in other words, why wouldn't he have tried to make a deal or something? Because, it's kind of pretty obvious what happened here, and it doesn't seem like his chances are very good at actually getting off. So why wouldn't he have tried to make a deal?
Well, for this last question, first of all, my best source of information was that article in the New York Times a couple of months ago, which said that he was prepared to make a deal for 10 years. But in order for that deal to be worthwhile, the feds would have had to agree not to prosecute him because he gets 10 years. Everyone says that's not enough. And then the feds come in and prosecute him and get him 20 years, so it wouldn't help. And so it sounds like that was pretty credible, and no one's disputing that it was true. We're just mad that it leaked out. And so that's his problem, is that if he gets, he's kind of stuck, because if he were to, even if he got some kind of a good deal from the state, it sounds he still faces federal prosecution, so it doesn't help him out much. So he basically is stuck having to fight things all the way. The other possibility is that I think that's probably what the reason is, but the other possibility is that, the record of getting police convicted is very dismal, and why not give it a shot and try to get off? But I think it's probably because he's worried he's got the federal prosecution hanging over his head. So even if he gets some deal from the state, it won't turn out to be a deal at the end.
Yeah,
could you explain the time? So if assuming that he gets charged in the federal court, and that he's convicted in state court, what does that mean for his time? How does the time work?
Well, since it's the same offense and it comes out of the same facts, he would the federal time would have to be, if he gets convicted and sentenced in state court, and then he would get convicted and sentenced in federal court, the time would have to be concurrent. They couldn't run it consecutive because he has to get credit for the time he's already serving for that offense. So the feds would have to give him more time than the state gave him in order to make it worthwhile. So concurrent is when for people who aren't familiar with the criminal process, is when you get two different sentences and you run them at the same time. So you get sentenced to something for 10 years, and then you get sentenced to the same. Then you get sentenced to something else for the similar offense for 15 years. And so what would happen is that they'd run at the same time, and you just do a total of 15 years minus good time. Now that's different from a consecutive sentence, where you pile one sentence on top of the other. So you kill two people and you get 40 years for one sentence and 20 years for the next sentence, and they might run consecutive. So you end up doing 60 years. That wouldn't be the case with Derek Chauvin if he got a federal and a state prosecution. The sentences would end up having to be concurrent.
So they'd be on top of each other. So.
Now they might not get credit for the time he spent in state custody. He might not get credit until he got charged by the feds. So there is some room, that we're kind of getting esoteric here. So like there's kind of some question about how the concurrent sentences would run and how much extra time you would have to do. But overall, it wouldn't, this is how it would work. It would be concurrent sentences.
There's a question about, you talked a little earlier about the fact that it's been hard to prosecute police officers. There's a question that says, is there any equivalent trials or case law historically for this case? Precedent happens on the appeal level, where the appeal courts decide what happened. They look at what happened at trial, and they say, well, this is how you're supposed to do things, or not. It's supposed to be how you do things, and that certainly is weighed a lot on the judge's rulings.
on various issues, particularly on the North case, which is deciding how broad is third-degree murder. But as far as looking at whether there's a conviction or not, there's not like you can't like look at the jury doesn't get told what other cases have decided. That's not so they have to look at the evidence and decide for themselves whether or not the person is guilty. So is there other cases though where police have been convicted of murder? Well, yeah, there was Mohammed Noor, the first time that where the races were reversed from where they usually are. I know the cop who murdered Con McDonald in Chicago, who is on video recording. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but that was like back in the mid 2010s, where there's squad video that showed the police shooting this young black man down and killing him. It was real blatant, and the mayor's office covered it up for over a year, until the mayor got reelected. That was Rahm Emanuel, and then after that, the video came out, and then the cop got prosecuted and convicted of murder. So there was another case in one of the Carolinas where I think the cop got convicted of murder as well. So it does happen.
Yeah.
Usually it has to be on video, and it's on video here.
Do you think that the defense will allow Chauvin to testify? And if they do allow him to testify, how does that affect his prior bad acts that the court is going to allow in?
And I know you saw us put the question out about his prior bad acts. So I know the court ruled that a couple of Chauvin's prior bad acts can come in on the prosecution's case. If he were to testify, the prosecution would probably be able to cross-examine him about a lot more bad acts. What the scope is, I don't think we know. And it would probably also depend on his testimony and how much it opened the door. But in all likelihood, it would allow the prosecution to go a lot more into his history as a cop and the other things that he's done. So that would, I think, kind of like anticipate what the issue is about why one of the reasons Chauvin might not want to testify is because it would open the door for the prosecution to, expose more of his prior misconduct to the jury. And so that would be a reason to stay off the stand. Now, from my perspective, from my analysis, if I were a prosecutor, it would be a dream to have Chauvin on the stand. I would just love to cross-examine the guy. I would go over that video. Go over the young woman's video, maybe some other videos. I would stop the video every 10 to 15 seconds, point out, where Chauvin's knee was, what his facial reaction was, what George Floyd's reaction was, and the fact that George Floyd was not offering any resistance. I think there's just so much opportunity there to just put this out in such detail. And unless Chauvin is such a sociopath and is brilliant, which he apparently isn't, and could just come up with smooth I just don't. Even if I don't know what kind of credible explanations he could come up with. So, to me, it just seems like it would be reinforcing the atrocity about what he did. It would be a chance to just nail it down even further. So, to me, it seems like he would just be exposing himself really badly if he testified. On social media, the discussion, another experienced criminal defense attorney who's actually defended cops thought that Chauvin has to take the stand because there's no other way to explain what he did. So I guess that's kind of the $64,000 question right now. Does Chauvin testify? And we'll have to see.
Yeah, and I think you make a great point about what the way that the prosecution would be able to tear him up if they did, because the judge has limited the ability for the prosecution to bring in his prior bad acts. I think the way that they limited it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, was to say that he could be because I happen to know one of the people that got subpoenaed to come in for this is the bad act being the knee on the neck, the prior knee on the neck incidents, because prior to killing George Floyd, there's documentation of at least 7 other prior incidents involving his knee on someone's neck. And one of those cases is one of the ones that got subpoenaed to go in. So it's interesting, but man, that would be something else, like you said, to be able to actually question him about why would you think that that's an acceptable procedure and so forth. And then it would be even more interesting to find out if he said something like, this is what they taught me in Minneapolis, or, that kind of thing. That would be astounding. I want to just switch us up for a second to talking about something that you raised earlier, Jordan, which is the necessity for the community to keep pushing for changes, because we are now, over 10 months since when George Floyd was killed. We're over that time period. And really, has anybody that's on this panel tonight seen any substantial changes, in state laws or in city policies or ordinances or police policies, anything like that, that would prevent us from having another incident of George Floyd? I'd love
I was going to say, I actually think that in the Senate, I just heard from our friend Mohammed with CARE that in the Senate, they just voted out a piece of legislation that would pull the license and deny the license of individuals who were affiliated with white supremacist groups. And that happened in the Judiciary Committee in the Senate on a party line vote.
So explain what you mean by that they voted it out.
That they didn't approve the measure, the amendment to the omnibus for the Senate. So a good piece of policy that would send a clear message that if you're affiliated with white supremacy, that you cannot be a cop. They voted that they didn't want that. The GOP didn't want that, and that's exactly what they did. So, and that's unfortunate, especially with everything that's going on here, that we're still seeing some of the same stonewalling and vitriol around racism within our own political structure. And that's a problem. That's a big problem. So,
and I think about I think that's very important. And I think about the qualified immunity bill that we have in the legislature right now, and the way that the cops lost their minds when we were testifying on this qualified immunity bill. You testified on it, Jonathan, and I testified in on another bill that same session, and they were literally the cops and the cop supporters on the Public Safety Committee literally had all this Blue Lives type stuff in the background, even as if like Blue Life is anything. I mean, that's like what, a Smurf, but right. What it was a Blue Life, right? But right. They had all these Blue Life things up in the background and all of this, and they were absolutely, just apoplectic about the idea that anybody would hold them accountable by ending qualified immunity. And in fact, they even wrote a letter to that effect this week that we responded to. So I don't know if you want to talk about that for a second, because that's pretty crazy.
Yeah. I'll just say about that is crazy what happened, but it's what's expected. When I testified on the qualified immunity, I made sure that I framed it in the qualified immunity around the Constitution, around our principles, around our history. And just to put that out there and come from a different space, so it wasn't a partisan issue. Not only that, I went and got a college professor, and a distinguished college professor on constitutional law, and brought him into the conversation as well. And he said that this is one area that Democrats and Republicans both agree on is getting rid of qualified immunity, that it should have never been passed when it was, because it was a form of judicial activism. And so when the former officers who are members of the House and on the GOP had that reaction, it was very clear that they don't care about the Constitution. They don't care about the people. They don't care about the families who lost their loved ones. They care about creating these walls that police officers can hide behind when they do something wrong. And what we're we're trying to do is we're trying to push back against that, because for decades, police departments have been out there in these legislatures and have had unlimited access to these legislators, and pushing their policies that absolve them of their crimes and remove the transparency from the system, that help cover their crimes and their transgressions up. And we're trying to fight against that, and it's been really challenging. And I don't think they've had people push back the way that we've pushed back as a collective against that, and they're losing their minds. To the letter point, you had a chief of police, the former chief of police, who signed on to a letter that was completely factually inaccurate and misleading, that was sent under the cover of night in order to persuade a legislative hearing, to try to influence a legislative hearing, after notice was already given, and they testified, and that letter got out, and we responded exactly the way that we needed to respond, and that was with facts and case law and history. And those are the things that we need to bring to the table. They're trying to win a public service announcement battle, and we're trying to win the battle based on facts and the stories of the families who lost loved ones to these police.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that we're asking people to do, we have 9 bills at the legislature. And these bills would do things like end qualified immunity, would make it so that families can access video footage of the deaths of their loved ones within 48 hours, would require, would put an end basically to police-only responses to mental health crisis calls. So important, because a person who is dealing with experiencing a mental health crisis is 16 times more likely than any other population to be killed by police. And then, like I said, we have 9 bills in total, and they're very important bills. And so we're asking for people. You can go to mncoalition.org and find an action that you can take, and be able to put in it. And just by putting your own name and your address in there, you'll be sending an email to your legislators urging them to support these bills. And like I said, these bills are important because we've got to change the underlying cause of what's happening here. And so far, the state and the city have utterly resisted making those changes. So we really need you to take those actions. Go to mncoalition.org, and you'll see right on the front page what you need to do. So, and then we also have that link in the chat for this particular session. So please, go right to that action, MN Coalition for Justice for George Floyd and All Stolen Lives, and take that action, folks. So we need lots of folks doing that.
I see. Thanks, Michelle. I've seen Nakima join us now. So Nakima, thank you so much for joining us. I guess we'll give you a chance. I know this week has been a very busy week, just like the other weeks. What is your general overview of the week?
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for the invitation to be a part of this conversation. I know that you all are wrapping up. I would just add, for people to understand that a lot of work is going on behind the scenes, as Michelle just alluded to. There are activists who are in the streets and also going into the halls of power, continuing to demand change, continuing to demand legislation that will improve policing in the Twin Cities and across the state of Minnesota. This trial has been very traumatic for so many of us. I urge people to make sure that you're taking care of yourself, that you're checking on the people around you, particularly Black people, Native people, and other people of color, because we see what I would call Black pain porn happening when we're having to watch these bystander videos over and over again. We know that we witnessed a modern day lynching, and we know that it's still possible that the officer in question might still not be held accountable through the justice system. And so that's very difficult to contend with, but that's the reality that we're facing right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've kind of mentioned that this week is a week of the law enforcement and medical experts talking about this case. What was your kind of just, I guess, your reaction to the testimony of the law enforcement that broke the blue line to some extent, and also the medical examiners that went, as far as just really talking about every movement that George Floyd did to gasp air, and how Chauvin used his entire body and the other officers to literally squeeze every last breath out of him.
Well, I will say that it is unusual for police officers to testify in a trial that is being broadcast around the world. I'm glad that Chief Arredondo tried to set the tone for the department in terms of coming forward and articulating his position about Chauvin's deadly actions towards George Floyd, as well as the testimony of other senior officials within the Minneapolis Police Department. But it does beg the question of, if the world was not watching this trial, would those law enforcement officials have come forward? Would they have crossed that blue wall of silence, or are they seeing Derek Chauvin as a sacrificial lamb to act as if the rest of the system is okay? It's just this one officer and maybe 3 others who were involved in killing a man, and we don't condone those actions. We know that even though they testified, even though we're glad they testified, the culture within Minneapolis police has not changed. We still have police officers beating people. We just had an incident 2 weeks ago where an officer punched a Black teenage boy in the face while other officers held him down. We know that there's still quite a bit of aggression that could and likely will happen against protesters as we take to the streets. And we know that not enough systemic changes have happened to root out the underlying racism within the police department, as well as an overall culture of a lack of discipline and accountability when police abuse people's civil and human rights. In terms of the testimony of the medical examiners, I have to be thankful for the testimony of Dr. Thomas earlier today, who did a very outstanding job articulating her perspective on how George Floyd died in terms of asphyxia or a lack of oxygen, and doing her best to preempt the testimony of Dr. Baker, who, from my perspective, could have done a more robust job in terms of articulating the role that Derek Chauvin's knee played in blocking air to George Floyd, rather than focusing on a bunch of other external conditions that were not responsible for George Floyd's death on May 25th of 2020. I think he tried to clean things up to the best of his ability, but he is a part of the system. And this is a system that is not used to holding police officers accountable. He's ruled other deaths at the hands of police as a homicide, but he has not faced this level of scrutiny from his initial autopsy report that he put forward. So I'm thankful that the prosecution is bringing on some of the foremost medical experts in the world to reinforce what the rest of us already know, and that is that Derek Chauvin's knee, the pressure they applied to George Floyd's body, and the physical pressure from the other officers resulted in the needless murder of George Floyd on May 25th of 2020. This also shows that if there were not bystanders present, young Black people in particular, standing there, videotaping what happened, coming to court, articulating what they experienced, the world would not know what happened to George Floyd. So I have to commend Darnella Frazier, her little cousin Judea, as well as Donna Williams, Charles McMillan, for stepping forward and being courageous in the face of extreme adversity and the possibility of retaliation, for speaking the truth about what they saw.
Thank you for that. And I want to say thank you to Jordan Kushner for joining us earlier. I know Jordan has to hop off, so appreciate your analysis earlier and kind of diving into that earlier today. Thank you, Jordan. Going back to Nakeem, I think, those are really good analysis of, where this case is going and where it's been. But, it almost feels like, the prosecution is doing every single thing possible to almost paint a picture that there wasn't anything else. And I don't know if this case, I don't know if you need all of this evidence, but apparently you do, because the reality is there's still a lot of people who don't believe that, Derek Chauvin and those 3 officers killed George Floyd. I mean, it's just mind-boggling that how much details have to be presented for the obvious to come out. And to your point, not only the medical examiner, Hennepin County medical examiner, but others have historically allowed for this type of, compliance with this narrative of the police. So is this case going to change the future of how families, sadly to say, this is going to continue to happen until we make radical changes, to respond to, or the potential that this case may actually start to have a larger impact besides the fact of being just one case that has been highly televised?
I think that the only way that things will change is if we, the people, continue fighting and standing up and scrutinizing all aspects of the system and holding those in positions of power accountable for the changes that we want to see. We need to be paying attention when the medical examiner is conducting an autopsy and publicly raising those concerns when we think that they missed the mark or they're rubber stamping police conduct through the way that they're articulating their positions in these situations. I also think that we need to continue to demand that there be an office of a special prosecutor who investigates and evaluates these cases, not the same old people working in the system. Now, it has been refreshing to see a prosecution team that consists of not only some of the best attorneys in Minnesota, but some of the best attorneys around the nation who are donating their time to join the prosecution team in this case. And so that's why we've seen the quality of the prosecution be higher than what we would ordinarily expect to see in a police killing case. In terms of the need for the Office of a Special Prosecutor, we saw that this week with regard to their reliance on the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension and some of their actions that reeked of corruption. From my perspective, how they claimed that they did a sweep of George Floyd's vehicle as well as the squad car in question after George Floyd was killed. And somehow miraculously, back in December, months after the fact, they were requested to go back in to do another sweep, and they somehow found remnants of little white pills. And they expect us to believe that they missed these alleged drugs the first time around. And so it definitely put the prosecution team in a very perplexing situation, because many of us watching the trial felt, those drugs might have been planted. We can't trust the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. These are cops investigating cops, and they have never been reliable in terms of standing on the side of justice. And I don't expect that to change through this trial.
And I think you're raising a great point, and I thank you for raising it, because we have for a very long time had a lot of issues and questions about the BCA and the quality of investigations. In our own organization, we do reinvestigate a number of death cases at the hands of police and find that the BCA has done an abysmal job. And it was interesting to watch them get torn up by the prosecution in both the Noor trial and now in this Derek Chauvin trial. So pretty clearly, they are not the ones to need to be doing these investigations. Also, there's kind of common things that get done in forensics, including the need to, have a chain of custody. And I'm appalled because the car wasn't sealed between the examinations. So that should discredit immediately the findings in the second search of the vehicle. Do you agree with that?
Well, they're claiming during some of the testimony that the car was sealed. They talked about there being some kind of strip on the cars where if you open the doors, the strip would break. So that is what they claim. But again, it's hard to believe that they missed these alleged drugs the first time around. I'm not sure, how sophisticated they are in terms of planting evidence and information, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did. We've talked about them potentially tampering with video evidence in the past. And even in the case of Justine Rusacek Damon, who wound up getting some semblance of justice through the conviction of Muhammad Noor, the reality is that even her father called out the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension and the fact that they seem to be incompetent in the situation. And so I see a comment from Sarah saying the Mercedes was sealed, but not the squad car. And I remember Sarah also posting something on Facebook about whether or not the officers in question actually had the opportunity to go into the squad car after they killed George Floyd, right? So there is a question about the chain of custody, what kind of protocols were followed. They probably thought this would be business as usual in terms of George Floyd being seen as a low-income Black man who used drugs and thinking that he was disposable and that no one would care about what happened to him, because that's what usually happens in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities when it comes to Black victims of police violence.
Absolutely. And I think that really speaks to the other thing that you raised, which is about the videos. And by that, what I'm talking about is, we've got a bill right now that would require police to share the body-worn camera videos with families within 48 hours. And that, how necessary and important that is. I've been saying, and when I testified on this, I said to the legislature that had there not been a bystander video, George Floyd's family would likely still be wondering what happened to him. And his name would never be known to the public.
Absolutely. And that's part of why we have to give the bystanders and the young people the credit that is due. It really pains me to see the defense attorney using such despicable tactics as trying to blame the bystanders for being present, for speaking out, calling them rowdy, saying they were a distraction, which we all know is a lie from the pit of hell. If it weren't for those bystanders, like you just said, we would not even know George Floyd's name. We wouldn't know what happened to him. The machine that the Minneapolis police rolled out in terms of propaganda was already in full effect. They had already put out a false press release claiming that George Floyd died as a result of a medical emergency and not mentioning the knee to the back of his neck on the part of Derek Chauvin. And that's what we see time and time again. Extreme corruption in this system. I'm hoping for justice, but even if there is justice in this case, we still have to keep a close eye on the system and scrutinize it at every hand, because they are doing their best to hold on to the status quo and gaslight us as if everything else is wonderful and this is an anomaly.
Right.
We know the opposite is true.
Right. And we still have to work very hard to make the changes that so far have been refused us. And so, again, we're going to ask people to take that action that was posted on the screen to make sure that you contact your legislators to pass the package of bills that we put into place. This could not be more important, you guys, because we can't go through this trial. We can't go through the pain and the heartache. We can't watch the family, not just of George Floyd, but of all the families suffering, from watching this trauma. And then yet come out of it on the other end exactly the same way we are going into it, and with no changes that would stop us from having another George Floyd case. That's where we're at right now, and we've got to change that.
Absolutely. And that to me means that the majority of Minnesotans need to step up and hold their elected officials accountable for passing these bills that you all have discussed and helping to transform the system. The fact that the majority of Minnesotans remain silent in the face of this oppression and abuse is why these things are allowed to happen. So I'm hoping that people will use the power and the privilege that they have to stand up and demand a complete overhaul and transformation of these systems. And that's looking at Governor Walz as well. Governor Walz needs to be held accountable as the chief executive officer of the state of Minnesota, who has an immense amount of power, for stepping up to the plate and using his bully pulpit to advocate for change and to make sure that he is providing more rigorous oversight of all of the state agencies, from the Department of Public Safety to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension to the Attorney General's office and any other institution that he has oversight of, to ensure that there is some form of change within these systems that will lead to a dramatic shift in what we are experiencing right now.
Absolutely. So one question that one of our viewers has asked is whether or not the people in who have been harmed, the crowd, the young people especially, who are traumatized by watching George Floyd die, whether they would have any kind of a civil action, or if there are ways for them to get mental health services.
Well, from a civil perspective, the only thing that comes to mind that it would be a long shot, but there's a body of cases in tort law that are focused on infliction of emotional distress. Jonathan is probably learning about that right now as a law student, but it's a tough hill to climb in order to prove that there was intentional infliction of emotional distress, for example. But that could be something that they try to claim depending upon the outcome of this case. I do believe, though, that the city does have some resources available for mental health care and resources, and that if the individuals in question want that support, if they reach out to us or if they reach out directly to the mayor's office, that they will get some support. But we know that it's not going to be enough based on what they experience. They need to be financially compensated as well for doing the job that the police should have done, which was to protect and to serve. And the other thing I'll add about the bystanders is, although we've seen them, be attempted to be demonized by the defense counsel in this case, and I expect to see more of that when the defense puts on its version of events in the case. If the bystanders had actually physically intervened and been rowdy and boisterous, as the defense attorneys are claiming, some of them either would have been dead and or they would be in prison right now for physically intervening as they were watching a murder unfold. And even with the chief's testimony, he talked about the fact that it's okay for bystanders to film police. It's okay for them to say things as long as they're not physically intervening. And I'm thinking, well, where does that leave the rest of us? If we're witnessing something like that, they didn't open the door for there to be any action that bystanders could take to physically intervene or to put forward a citizen's arrest when they see officers abusing their power under the law. And so we still don't know what we're expected to do if we see something like that happening, knowing that there are police officers who have killed people and who have not been held accountable.
It's a great point, an excellent point. So one of the other questions that has come up a couple of times, like I said, they're going to make a lot about the, physical condition of George Floyd. We already knew that was one of the pillars that they plan to rely on in the defense. But isn't Minnesota a but-for state? Like, in other words, if, but for the action of Derek Chauvin, George Floyd wouldn't be dead?
Well, the primary focus is on whether or not the defense can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the actions of Derek Chauvin resulted in the death of George Floyd, right? So notwithstanding all of these other issues, they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Derek Chauvin's knee to George Floyd's neck and back is the reason for him dying on May 25th of 2020. And so that's why the defense counsel is trying so hard to distract the jury, confuse the jury, poke holes, find alternative perpetrators such as the bystanders, and trying to also put George Floyd on trial for his own death.
Yeah.
All he has to do is convince one juror that Derek Chauvin is not responsible for the murder of George Floyd, which it's devastating to think about, that one person can make a difference in terms of whether Chauvin and the other 3 officers are ultimately held accountable.
So we do have a question from one of our viewers about whether or not any of the brave witnesses have funds that the person had donated to Judea's fund, but are there other funds that we know about there?
So there's Judea's fund. Donald Williams also has a fund. He has a mental health fund that some of us contributed to last week. I know early on that there were talks of a fund for Darnella Frazier. So she may also have a GoFundMe. That's all I've seen so far. Donald Williams Fund, Judea's Fund, and I believe there was a fund for Darnella Frazier.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just can't imagine how excruciating it must have been for those witnesses to see this stuff happen and not be able to do anything about it. And because we know that what you said is right. If they had gone toward, because Tou Thao was, kind of blocking the crowd and taunting them to a certain degree, walking up on people, all of that. And we know that if any of them had attempted to intervene physically, that one of the cops would have pulled a gun and shot that person.
Absolutely. And there would have been an even more egregious narrative as far as witnesses, bystanders, and Black people are concerned if they had physically intervened. And I'm thinking they might as well had, if they're going to paint these individuals who are heroes as villains, yes. Right? Can you imagine if they all made a decision to go rush Tou Thao, to go rush Derek Chauvin? They would have likely been killed. They would have likely been sent to prison. And then the rest of the folks in Minnesota and around the nation would be demonizing them for interfering with police carrying out their duties, quote unquote. So again, where does that leave us as a public when we see corruption happening, when we see violence and brutality happening, when we see police abusing their authority? Are we just supposed to stand there and watch? Or can we intervene physically if we feel that the circumstances call for that? And that question has still not been answered. Anyone who does physically intervene is taking a significant risk of their own lives being lost in the process. I saw an interview within the last week or so on CNN, and there is a professor, a well-known Black professor, and social justice advocate who basically said, the bystanders should have intervened. He would have intervened. We can't have that happening. And it made, Don Lemon cry. And I was really upset when I actually watched that, because I'm thinking no one knows what they would have done if they were in that situation. Okay. It's very easy to say that. But when we saw the bystander videos and we saw the aggression, particularly of Tou Thao, when we saw that from the witnesses that he and Derek Chauvin both had their hands on their pepper spray, they put forward a very intimidating atmosphere. And these were young people, some of the bystanders. And the fact that these guys are fully armed, they have the power of the law on their side. They have the history of white supremacy on their side in a state that's 84% white. I mean, what more do we expect people to do? They shouldn't have been put in that situation in the first place. And if our elected officials had reined in the Minneapolis Police Department a long time ago, we wouldn't even be in this situation to begin with. So they are ultimately responsible for the culture of the Minneapolis Police Department, not those bystanders.
Absolutely.
I think that's a good point, Michelle, about the bystanders, and the most important thing that I think is absolutely essential is that, the fact of the matter that they were there alone was significant. The fact that they stayed and watched, the fact that they intervened from a safe distance perspective, because to be honest with you, I mean, we all think that we could have done something different, but the reality is that they would have shot them, and they would have had probable cause to shoot them to some extent with the way the laws are set up. So, I just want people to know that, you can stand there And, one of the saddest things that I think, there's so many of these moments in this trial. One of the saddest things was Donald saying, I called the police on the police. I mean, think about this. That the only option you had was to call other police to police these officers. And there's 3 of them that could have policed and they didn't. Right. And so I think hats off to all of these bystanders. And I don't think none of us want to be in that position. None of us want to carry that burden. None of us want to be the ones who were in that scene. And it's a traumatizing thing for all of them. And for all of us who just now know it from a video perspective, but to be there. And by the way, this is not the only bystanders. There's been a lot of bystanders in a lot of these incidents and cases. And so to all of you out there, whoever done that, you are our heroes. And again, this is state violence. This is the thing that is different from other times of violence. This is state-sanctioned violence. This is taxpayer dollar violence. We were all guilty on that day for paying the taxes to a city that kills our people. And I think that's a burden that all of us who are watching this trial should bear and elect officials that are going to be responsive, but most importantly, also change policies. And that's why we want to be demanding for justice, both inside this courthouse and outside. And I think we all deserve that. And so hats off to the bystanders. I think that's a thing that I this idea that, all of us could have been cowboys. No, you can't be if you're a Black person, no, you can't be a cowboy. Absolutely not. They'll shoot you and the rest of America will move on.
And, and one of our viewers also raised that, look, even the white female firefighter couldn't step in and intervene, and felt helpless. You surely can't expect children to take on that role. And so that's a magnificent, recognition of how incredibly awful it is to be standing there and be so helpless. And yet, even in that, those young people and others stood. They tried to call out to the police. They certainly videotaped. Again, without that videotape was everything. And so, the work that they did and the, being there and videotaping that is incredibly brave. Jaylani, do you want to, because we're probably getting through the end of our session now, but do you want to remind people about what's going on tonight?
Yeah, so all of us, most of you are aware. We're not stopping protesting. We're all traumatized by this case, but we're not stopping. And there are a lot of events for you to come out, meet with other activists, and be heard. And tonight we're doing something different. We are protesting at night, and also holding a vigil in downtown. So I encourage all of you guys to come out. The event is called "We Can't Sleep If We're Not Safe from Police Violence," and it's really true. This for many of us, this trial is not just about George Floyd alone and his family. It's all of our families, and it's all collectively of all of our families. It's everything. It's George Floyd and all of these families. It's all of us. And we all need to make change, and we are demanding for that. And so I hope all of you can join us tonight in downtown Minneapolis. It'll start at 9 p.m. at the Government Center. This is not the only event. We do have another event this Sunday. Encourage all of you to come out too for Justin Teigen and Justin Teigen. Yeah, Justin Teigen.
2:00 on Sunday.
Yeah, it's on Sunday. I'll pull that up too. So it's important that we continue to show up. A lot of people are wondering, what can I do? I've been watching the trial. What can I do? Where can I go? Where can I be at? And so Justin Teigen, who was killed by the St. Paul Police Department and thrown in a dumpster and brutally killed. That event will be at 2 p.m. on Sunday on 1450 University Avenue in St. Paul. You can get all of this online if you go to our Facebook pages for all the coalition groups here. We're all part of this wonderful event. So I encourage all of you to come out Sunday, and then obviously tonight, 9 p.m. in downtown Minneapolis. And there will be further actions and events coming up. So I encourage you to do that. If you're going to come out, bring somebody with you. Call a friend, neighbor, have them come out. This is what we have to do. And I want to be really, realistically and mindful to all the folks in Minnesota. This is happening here. This is not on some TV somewhere, someplace far distance where we're all watching. This is happening in our community, and we got to show up. We can't expect people from, Florida to be showing up on the streets for Minneapolis. It's people in Minneapolis and people in the state of Minnesota that need to show up. And I encourage all of you to come out and be there. And I know there's a lot of things happening. I know incident that took place this past couple of days with White Bear High School as well. So, I know those students who have been targeted and threatened by white supremacy. We stand in solidarity with them and support them. I know they had a walkout early this morning. Folks, we got to get out and continue to fight and demand justice. And unfortunately, some of you may have missed out earlier too, that there was the Senate, the GOP Senate in the state of Minnesota actually failed to move a bill forward that would have required police officers who are found to be part of white supremacist group. White supremacist group is the KKK, okay?
Yeah. National Socialist things, that kind of stuff. Oh, I think we lost Jelani, but we are wrapping up. But what we do, want to make sure we talk about is this. We've got this event tonight at 9:00 at the Hennepin County Government Center. Keep in mind that Darnella Frazier said she can't sleep at night because she, prays and wonders what she could have done to save George Floyd's life. This is the brave woman who took that video and put it out that very same night. I'll never forget seeing that video that night and immediately recognizing Derek Chauvin and quickly putting up his whole history on Facebook for people to see it. I'll never forget, and we could never have done that without her. And she still thinks she didn't do enough, and she's still staying awake at night in pain and agony over what happened and what she witnessed. So, how dare we think we need to be in our beds home, cozy, sleeping, and letting this city get away with this stuff. It's on us to make sure that we make this city and we make this state make the changes that they have to make. And we shouldn't be sleeping until we can do that.
Absolutely. Jaylani is back now. Do you want to close us out, or did Muhammad want to say something?
Go ahead, Muhammad, if you want to close us out.
And to also finish off, Jaylani's point is that we're hearing that it's very difficult to condemn Nazis and white supremacists and not to allow them in the police force as we see it in the GOP vote. But tonight, we need to continue, as we continue to demand for justice inside the courtrooms, we need to get justice outside the courtrooms. And that justice is not just in policy, but also in police practices and also making sure that communities are safe from state-sanctioned violence. So come out and support tonight. We'll be at the south side of the plaza at the Hennepin Government Center. So please and continue to demand justice in all of its various forms. So so thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and close out. Thanks for everybody that joined, and we'll see you tonight, and we'll also see you on Sunday for the Justice for Justin event as well for family supporting families. All right, everybody, take care.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Michelle and Jonathan and Jordan that joined us earlier.
Thank you.